August 2nd, 216 BC. No, wait. Wrong battle. Wrong century. This story begins 40 years earlier, in a narrow pass on the coast of central Greece, where the mountains come down so close to the sea that a wagon could barely fit between them, where sulphurous hot springs bubbled up from the rocks and gave the place its name, where 300 soldiers from the most feared military city in the ancient world stood in the path of the largest army that had ever been assembled on the face of the earth. You know this story. You have seen the movie. You remember the shields and the capes and the slow-motion violence and the speeches about glory and freedom. You remember Gerard Butler screaming into the camera. What you probably do not know is that almost everything the movie told you was wrong. Not the courage, not the sacrifice, not the outcome. Those things happened. Almost everything else, the reasons, the context, the people, the meaning, was simplified, distorted, or invented outright by a story that preferred spectacle to truth. The real story of Thermopylae is more complicated than the movie. It is also more interesting. It involves a 55-year-old king who chose his own death as a strategic act. It involves 700 soldiers from a city you have probably never heard of, who made the same choice, and whose names have been almost entirely forgotten by history. It involves the largest military logistics operation the ancient world had ever attempted. It involves a Greek political coalition that barely held together long enough to matter, and a Persian king who genuinely could not understand why the people in the pass would not simply submit. And it involves 3 days that changed the direction of Western civilization. Not by winning. Thermopylae was not a victory. The Greeks lost. The pass fell. The Persians marched through and burned Athens to the ground. The 3 days at Thermopylae mattered because of what they made possible afterward, because of the time they purchased, because of what the living did with the time the dead bought for them. That is the story. It starts before the pass. It starts with a beach and a battle and a humiliation that a Persian king carried to his grave. Before Thermopylae, there was Marathon. In September of 490 BC, a Persian army landed on the plain of Marathon on the eastern coast of Attica, the region whose main city was Athens, and prepared to march inland. They had crossed the Aegean Sea from the Persian-controlled coast of Asia Minor with an estimated force of 20 to 25,000 soldiers. Their objective was punishment. Athens and the city of Eretria on the island of Euboea had supported a revolt by Greek cities under Persian rule in Asia Minor. Darius, king of kings, great king of Persia, ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen, had sent an expedition to make clear to these distant city-states what the cost of such impertinence was. The Persian Empire in 490 BC was something the Greeks had no true framework for understanding. It had been built over 3 generations by Cyrus the Great, who created it, by Cambyses, who added Egypt, and by Darius, who consolidated and expanded it into a structure that stretched from the Greek cities of the Aegean coast in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to the deserts of Libya in the south. It was not simply large. It was administratively sophisticated, with a road network, a postal system, a standardized currency, and a bureaucracy capable of managing the affairs of dozens of distinct peoples and languages under a single imperial framework. Greece, from the Persian perspective, was barely worth categorizing. The Greek world consisted of several hundred small, independent city-states, poleis, scattered across the Aegean coastline, the Greek mainland, and the islands between them. The largest Greek city, Athens, had a citizen population of perhaps 40,000 adult men. It had no standing army in the modern sense. It had no unified government with any other Greek city. Greek city-states spent as much energy fighting each other as they did anything else, and had been doing so for centuries. What Greece had, that Persia had not fully accounted for, was terrain, a tradition of citizen soldiers fighting in tight formations, and a political culture that made those soldiers fight for something other than fear. The Athenians marched out to Marathon and met the Persian force on the plain. They were outnumbered. They had no cavalry. They had received essentially no support from the other Greek states. Sparta sent a runner promising troops, but arrived one day late, held back by a religious festival. The Athenians and their small Plataean contingent faced the Persians essentially alone. What happened next has been studied and argued about for 2,500 years. The Athenian general Miltiades ordered an attack, a charge across the plain to close the distance before Persian archers could thin the Greek ranks. That broke the Persian formation in a battle that lasted perhaps an hour or two. 6,400 Persians were killed. 192 Athenians died. The numbers in those ratios tell you something about the completeness of the Athenian victory and the shock of the Persian defeat. The Persian fleet carried its survivors home. Darius began planning a larger invasion, one that would not make the same mistakes, one that would bring a force so overwhelming that Greek resistance would be impossible. He died before he could launch it. In 486 BC, after dealing with a revolt in Egypt, Darius died and was succeeded by his son Xerxes. Xerxes inherited the empire. He also inherited the unfinished business of Greece. For a Persian king of Xerxes' generation, the defeat at Marathon was not merely a military setback. It was a stain on the honor of the Persian throne. The first time in 3 generations that a Persian army had been sent to punish a minor power and had failed. Every satrap, every subject king, every general and nobleman in the Persian court understood what Marathon meant. It meant that Persia could be beaten. That understanding was dangerous. It needed to be corrected. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing the correction. What he assembled was something the ancient world had never seen. The scale of the Persian preparations for the invasion of Greece was so extreme that the ancient sources describing it were dismissed as obvious exaggeration for centuries until archaeological and logistical analysis forced historians to reconsider. The preparations were real. They were simply so large that they looked like fiction. Xerxes ordered a canal cut through the peninsula of Athos, a finger of land jutting 20 miles into the northern Aegean Sea. A previous Persian fleet had been destroyed, trying to round the Cape of Athos in a storm. Rather than risk the weather again, Xerxes ordered the isthmus cut through entirely. The canal was wide enough for 2 fully crewed triremes to pass each other rowing. It took 3 years to dig. It is one of the largest engineering projects the ancient world attempted, and it was built not as an infrastructure investment, but as a military preparation for a single campaign. He ordered supply depots built at intervals along the entire line of march, from the Hellespont through Thrace and Macedonia and into Greece. Years of grain and provisions pre-positioned to feed an army of hundreds of thousands of men on the move. He ordered 2 bridges of boats constructed across the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water, perhaps a mile wide, that separates Asia from Europe at its narrowest point. Hundreds of ships were lashed together side by side, cables strung between them, a roadbed of planks and compacted earth laid over the top. When a storm destroyed the first set of bridges before the army could cross, Xerxes reportedly had the sea flogged with chains as punishment and had the engineers responsible executed before ordering new bridges built. Whether the flogging of the sea actually happened or was added by later storytellers to illustrate his rage is unclear. The new bridges were built either way. The army that assembled at Sardis in the spring of 480 BC and began crossing into Europe at the Hellespont was drawn from across the empire. Herodotus, writing within living memory of the events, gives numbers for the Persian force that range into the millions, a figure that even ancient critics found implausible, and that modern historians unanimously reject as impossible to supply or move. The actual size of Xerxes' force is genuinely uncertain and has been argued about for generations. Conservative modern estimates range from 150,000 to 300,000 soldiers, with a naval complement of perhaps 600 to 800 warships. Even at the low end of these estimates, it was the largest military force assembled in the ancient world up to that point. It was also, unusually for an ancient army, genuinely multinational. The Persian army at its core, the Immortals, and the Persian and Median infantry, was supplemented by contingents from across the empire. Lydians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, Ethiopians, Bactrians, Thracians, Macedonians, and dozens of other peoples marched under the Persian banner, each in their own equipment and fighting style, each under their own commanders, but subordinate to the Persian command structure. They crossed the Hellespont in a procession that the ancient sources say took 7 days and 7 nights without stopping. Day and night, continuously, for a week. The supply train alone stretched for miles. Greece received the news with the response that small countries always produce when confronted with a threat too large to fully process, a combination of terror, denial, calculation, and the paralysis that comes from knowing that the decision you make in the next few months will determine whether your city still exists in a year. The Greek response to the Persian invasion was not the unified stand of freedom-loving peoples that later tradition made it. It was messier, more complicated, and more revealing of human nature than that version allows. In the autumn of 481 BC, 31 Greek city-states sent representatives to a congress at Corinth, the first time in Greek history that a significant coalition had agreed to meet and discuss anything collectively. The Congress formed the Hellenic League and agreed in principle to resist the Persian invasion. 31 cities out of perhaps 700 that existed in the Greek world at that time, the majority of Greek polis either submitted to Persia before the invasion, a process the Greeks called medizing, aligning with the Medes, or simply waited to see what happened without committing to either side. The Thessalians medized, the Boeotians outside Thespiae medized, the Macedonians medized. The Argives, ancient enemies of Sparta, declared neutrality. Even within the 31 cities that joined the Hellenic League, cooperation was grudging and perpetually threatened by the mutual suspicion between the two powers that mattered most, Athens and Sparta. Athens and Sparta were not natural allies. They had competing visions of what Greek civilization should look like, competing political systems, and a history of backing opposite sides in inter-Greek conflicts. Athens was a naval democracy, commercially active, culturally innovative, politically turbulent, populated by citizens who argued about everything. Sparta was a land oligarchy, militarily dominant, culturally conservative, politically stable, and structured around an economy built on the labor of an enslaved population called the Helots, whom the Spartans outnumbered by perhaps 7 to 1 and lived in constant low-level fear of. The Spartans had the finest land army in Greece. The Athenians had the finest fleet. Without both, resistance to Persia was impossible. With both, together, it was barely possible. They agreed to fight together in the way that entities with incompatible worldviews sometimes agree to cooperate when the alternative is mutual destruction. Reluctantly, with maximum suspicion, for the minimum time necessary. The man most responsible for making that cooperation produce an actual strategy was Themistocles, the Athenian general and politician who had been preparing Athens for exactly this confrontation for nearly a decade. In 483 BC, when a new vein of silver was discovered in the Athenian state mines at Laurium, the conventional expectation was that the windfall would be divided among the citizens, roughly 10 drachmas per person, a meaningful sum. Themistocles argued instead that the silver should be used to build a fleet of 200 triremes. He framed the argument around an ongoing dispute with the island of Aegina, which Athenians found more immediately credible than the distant Persian threat. The assembly voted for the fleet. Without those 200 ships, Salamis does not happen. Without Salamis, the Persian army cannot be supplied through a Greek winter. Without that, nothing that follows from Thermopylae matters, because there is no one left to do anything with the time. Everything that made Greek resistance possible, the fleet, the coalition, the strategy, the survival of Western civilization as the Greeks practiced it, traces back to a vote in an Athenian assembly about what to do with silver mine revenues. The most consequential municipal budget decision in ancient history was made by ordinary Athenian citizens who probably thought they were voting about Aegina. The Hellenic League agreed at Corinth to hold a defensive line somewhere that the Persian army's numerical advantage could be negated by terrain. The first attempt was the Vale of Tempe in northern Thessaly, a narrow valley between Mount Olympus and Mount Ossa. A Greek force marched north and discovered within days that Tempe could be bypassed through the mountains. They withdrew. The second choice was Thermopylae. Thermopylae, in 480 BC, was a different landscape from what visitors find there today. 2,500 years of river sediment depositing against the coastline have extended the land outward into what was in 480 BC, the shallow waters of the Malian Gulf, creating a broad coastal plain where ancient writers describe a pass barely wide enough for a wagon. Modern measurements of the ancient coastline, based on geological analysis of the sediment layers, suggest that the narrowest point of the pass, the Middle Gate, where the Greeks chose to make their stand, was between 15 and 60 feet wide, with the vertical rock face of Mount Kalidromos on one side and the sea on the other. The name Thermopylae means hot gates. The hot springs that gave it the name still exist. Sulfurous water that comes out of the rock face at temperatures well above body heat, filling the pass with the faint smell of rotten eggs on a still day. The pass had been known by this name for centuries before the battle that would make it the most famous defensive position in ancient military history. The Greek force that assembled at Thermopylae in late August of 480 BC numbered approximately 7,000 soldiers. The breakdown of the force included contingents from Sparta, Thespiae, Thebes, Corinth, Phlius, Mycenae, and several other Greek cities, as well as 1,000 Phocians stationed on the mountain path above the pass. The Spartan contingent numbered 300, specifically 300, a number chosen and constrained by the religious law of the Carneia festival, which prohibited the full Spartan army from campaigning during its observance. This is the detail that the film erased most completely, and it is the detail that most changes the meaning of the story. The 300 were not the entire Greek effort at Thermopylae. They were the legal advance guard of an army that was supposed to follow when the Carneia ended. The Greek strategy at Thermopylae was not a final stand by 300 men who knew they were all that stood between Persia and Greece. It was a delaying action by an advance force while the main Greek army prepared to move north. The 300 were holding the pass until the rest of the army arrived. The rest of the army did not arrive in time. Leonidas, the Spartan king who commanded at Thermopylae, was approximately 55 years old in 480 BC. He had been king for roughly 10 years inheriting the throne after the deaths of his older brothers. He had a wife, Gorgo, the daughter of a previous Spartan king, who appears in the ancient sources as one of the more remarkable women the ancient world produced, known for sharp political intelligence and a clarity about Persian power that her husband shared. He had a son who was too young to campaign. Spartan kingship in 480 BC was not absolute monarchy. Sparta had two kings simultaneously, a dual kingship whose origins lay in the earliest Spartan history, and both were constrained by a council of elders called the Gerousia, and 5 annually elected magistrates called the ephors, who held substantial political power. The king was primarily a military and religious leader, not an unlimited ruler. Leonidas chose his 300 men with specific care. The ancient sources, particularly Herodotus, record that he selected only men who had already produced sons, men whose family lines would continue if they died in the pass. This is not a small detail. It tells you precisely what Leonidas expected to happen at Thermopylae before he marched. He did not expect to hold the pass indefinitely. He expected to die there. He chose men who could die there without ending their bloodlines. The selection was not a gesture of heroic self-sacrifice. It was the practical planning of a military commander who understood his situation clearly and was arranging the details accordingly. The ancient sources preserve a number of remarks attributed to Leonidas from the days at the pass, some of which are almost certainly historical, others of which were probably invented in the decades after the battle to illustrate what people believed about Leonidas's character. When a Persian envoy came to demand the Greeks lay down their arms, Leonidas sent back the message preserved in 2 Greek words, "Malon lub," come and take them. Whether he said it in exactly those words, or the tradition compressed something longer into that phrase is unknowable. What is knowable is that the Greeks did not surrender. When someone reportedly told him that the Persian arrows would be so numerous they would block the sun, a Spartan in his entourage, the sources give different names, said, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." Whether it was said or invented later, it captures something true about the psychology the Spartans brought to Thermopylae. They had been preparing for this their entire lives. Spartan military culture was, by the standards of any ancient society, extraordinary in its intensity and totality. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 and entered the agage, a state-run educational and military training system that lasted until the age of 30, when a Spartan man was finally considered fully trained and could establish his own household. The training was physically brutal, deliberately so, designed to produce soldiers who could function in conditions of extreme hardship, cold, hunger, and violence. Spartans ate communally in messes called syssitia for their entire adult lives, maintaining the cohesion of the military unit as a social structure even in peacetime. The result was a military force unlike any other in the Greek world, not larger, not better equipped, more completely and absolutely dedicated to warfare as a way of life than any other ancient society produced. When Leonidas and his 300 marched to Thermopylae, knowing they were likely to die there, they were not making an unusual sacrifice by Spartan standards. They were doing what they had been trained from childhood to do. The unusual thing about Thermopylae was not that they were willing to die. It was that they had chosen the right ground to make their death worth something. Xerxes arrived at Thermopylae with his army and stopped. He sent scouts forward. The scouts reported something that confused the Persian king. The Greeks at the entrance to the pass were exercising, doing athletic drills in the open, as though entirely unconcerned about the force facing them. Some of them were combing their long hair, which was the Spartan custom when preparing for battle. Xerxes summoned Demaratus, a former Spartan king who had fled to the Persian court years earlier after being deposed in a political dispute, and who served Xerxes as an advisor on Greek affairs. He asked Demaratus what the Greeks were doing. Demaratus told him they were preparing to fight. He told Xerxes that these were Spartans, and that Spartans combed their hair before a battle they intended to die in. He told Xerxes that these men would fight harder than any soldiers the king had ever faced, and that they would not yield the pass without taking more Persian lives than Xerxes was prepared to pay. Xerxes did not believe him. He sent a messenger forward, demanding the Greeks lay down their arms and depart. Leonidas sent Molon Lub. Xerxes waited 4 days. He waited because he genuinely expected the Greeks to disperse or negotiate. The possibility that they intended to stand in that pass against everything he had brought from Asia did not fit his model of how the world worked. He had spent his entire life in an empire where power produced submission. The visible scale of what he commanded, the dust cloud of the army stretching miles behind him, the fleet anchored along the coast as far as the eye could reach, had caused the submission of every power he had encountered. The Greeks in the pass appeared to have not noticed. On the 5th day, Xerxes sent the Medes. The first day of fighting at Thermopylae established the pattern that would hold for 2 complete days. It was a pattern that Xerxes had no framework to understand and no tactical answer for, and it remains one of the most complete examples in ancient military history of how correctly chosen terrain can neutralize overwhelming numerical advantage. The Medes were experienced soldiers, the military backbone of the Persian Empire for generations, disciplined, brave, and accustomed to victory. They advanced into the pass in formation. The Greeks retreated. This was not a rout. It was a choreographed maneuver, the Greek phalanx falling back in order, drawing the Medes deeper into the narrowing pass, and then turning and driving into them with the full weight of the formation. The technique was one that Leonidas and his officers had almost certainly planned and practiced before the battle began. The mechanics of what made this so effective require a moment of explanation, because they are not intuitive without understanding what a Greek hoplite phalanx was and what it could do. A Greek hoplite was a heavy infantryman equipped with a bronze helmet, a bronze breastplate or leather corselet, bronze greaves protecting the lower legs, a large round shield called an aspice that was roughly 3 feet in diameter and made of layered wood faced with bronze, and a thrusting spear approximately 8 feet long. The shield was designed not only to protect the man carrying it, but specifically to cover the left side of the man standing to his right. The shield wall of the phalanx was a collective defensive system, each man dependent on and contributing to the protection of the man beside him. The phalanx in formation was extraordinarily difficult to stop by frontal assault. It presented a wall of overlapping shields and extended spearheads that created a killing zone in front of the formation that an attacker had to penetrate before he could reach the men behind the shields. Against an enemy who came straight at it on open ground, the phalanx was close to unstoppable. At Thermopylae, the terrain transformed these qualities from merely excellent to decisive. The pass at its narrowest point allowed perhaps 20 to 30 men across, at most. The Persian army, whatever its true size, could put no more men into the actual fighting than the Greeks could. The tens of thousands waiting behind the front ranks were irrelevant. They could not get forward. They could only stand in the pass behind the men who were dying, wait their turn, and then advance into the same wall of shields and spears. The Greeks rotated their men systematically. Fresh units moved to the front, while tired ones stepped back to rest. The Persians arriving at the Greek line had marched through the press of thousands waiting in the pass behind them, compressed, unable to move freely, arriving at the point of contact in the worst possible condition to fight men who had just stepped into line fresh. Additionally, and this is a detail the sources emphasize, the Greek spear was significantly longer than most of the weapons the Persians carried. The Greek line could wound and kill Persian soldiers before Persian weapons could reach Greek bodies. The exchange was catastrophic for the attackers. The Medes pushed. They made no progress. They took casualties. Xerxes pulled them back. He sent another unit. The same thing happened. He sent the Immortals. The Immortals were the elite core of the Persian land forces. 10,000 soldiers maintained at exactly that number by the immediate replacement of any casualty, so that the unit never visibly diminished. They were the personal guard of the great king, the finest soldiers Persia produced, veterans of the campaigns that had extended Persian power from Egypt to India. They had never failed in battle. They failed at Thermopylae. They failed not because they were outfought individually, in one-on-one combat. Any of them might have beaten any Greek soldier they faced. They failed because the terrain meant they never got to fight one-on-one. They got to push into a narrow pass against a wall of shields that did not move, take casualties at a rate they could not sustain, and withdraw. Herodotus says that Xerxes, watching from a throne set up on the hillside above the pass, rose to his feet 3 times during the fighting. It is the only record in ancient sources of Xerxes showing a visible physical reaction during a battle. He had watched his best soldiers fail to move 7,000 Greeks in a pass that should have been no obstacle for an army of his size. The first day ended with the pass still held. The second day was identical. On the evening of the second day, a man came to the Persian camp. His name was Ephialtes. He was Greek, from the region of Malis, near Thermopylae, where his family had farmed and herded for generations. He knew the mountains above the pass, the way a man knows the land he has walked since childhood. And he brought Xerxes information that the Persian king's own scouts had failed to discover. There was another path. The Anopeia path wound through the mountains above the pass, a shepherd's trail invisible from below, existing in the knowledge of the local population and nowhere else. It emerged behind the Greek position. It was a hard night march through difficult terrain, but it was passable for a large force of infantry. The ancient sources treat Ephialtes with contempt, a traitor who betrayed Greece for money or personal advantage. What he actually was, almost certainly, was a local man making the same calculation that dozens of Greek cities had already made. Persia was going to win. Accommodating yourself to the winning side while the accommodation was still worth something was rational. Not heroic, but rational. The ancient world was full of rational choices that subsequent history rendered despicable. Xerxes sent the Immortals up the Anopeia path that night, guided by Ephialtes. Leonidas had known about the path. He was not an incompetent general who had failed to account for a possible flanking route. He had specifically positioned a force of 1,000 Phocian soldiers at the upper end of the trail to defend against exactly this scenario. When the Immortals emerged from the trail at dawn and found the Phocians waiting, the Greek defensive plan was in operation. What happened next is the most debated moment in the Thermopylae narrative. The Phocians, confronting a force of 10,000 elite Persian soldiers appearing out of the pre-dawn darkness, withdrew to higher ground rather than holding the trail. They chose to defend themselves on the high ground rather than hold the path itself. Whether this was cowardice, a tactical misunderstanding, shock at the scale of what was coming, or a rational decision that holding the trail against 10,000 Immortals was impossible, the ancient sources disagree, and they disagree in ways that reflect their own political biases. Herodotus, writing as an Athenian-adjacent narrator, is relatively charitable to the Phocians. Later, Spartan-inflected traditions are not. What is certain is that the trail wasn't held. A runner reached Leonidas before dawn with the news. The Greek commanders met in council. The strategic situation was now irrecoverable. The pass could not be held against attacks from both ends simultaneously. The force had to withdraw or die in place. Most of the Greek contingents withdrew. The Corinthians, the Arcadians, the Mantineans, the men from Phlius and Mycenae, they retreated south in good order, alive, to fight at Salamis and Plataea. Their decision was not cowardice. It was the decision of commanders who understood that dying uselessly in a lost position served nothing. They had families. Their cities had walls that needed defending. The war was not over. Leonidas stayed. He stayed with his 300 Spartans. He stayed with the 700 Thespians, soldiers from the city of Thespiae, a mid-sized Boeotian town that lay directly in the Persian line of march, whose fighters had come to Thermopylae, knowing that their city's destruction was coming, regardless of what happened in the pass, who had nowhere to go and no retreat that meant anything. He stayed with approximately 400 Thebans, whose presence and motivations are disputed in sources written by people who were not Theban. 700 Thespians. Let that number sit for a moment. They appear once in Herodotus. They appear briefly in a few other ancient sources. They do not appear in the movie. Their names are not preserved. The city of Thespiae was razed by the Persians within days of Thermopylae. Every building destroyed, every inhabitant killed or enslaved. The Thespians who died in the pass were among the last of their city's free citizens. They knew this when they stayed. The Spartan epitaph has been carried down through 25 centuries and translated into every language in the world. The Thespian epitaph, if one was ever composed, has been lost. They stayed anyway. Why did Leonidas stay? This is the question the ancient sources circle, and the one the movie converts into a simple answer. Glory, freedom, the Spartan way. The reality offered by the historical record is more complex and more interesting. One explanation is religious. Before the campaign, Leonidas had consulted the oracle at Delphi and received a response that said either Sparta would be destroyed or a Spartan king would die. This is reported by Herodotus and may well be accurate. Delphi was consulted before most major Greek military undertakings, and the oracle's responses were taken with extraordinary seriousness. If Leonidas believed that his death was the price of Sparta's survival, staying in the pass was not irrational. It was the fulfillment of a divine bargain. Another explanation is cultural and political. A Spartan king retreating from an enemy was not simply a tactical decision. It was an act with catastrophic cultural consequences. The Spartan system's entire claim to legitimacy rested on the absolute military virtue of its soldiers, and especially its leaders. A king who fled could not remain king. A king who retreated might return home alive, but would spend whatever remained of his life politically destroyed. Leonidas faced a choice between dying in the pass and dying in Sparta, the second death being, by Spartan standards, far worse. A third explanation is the most straightforwardly military, and perhaps the most convincing. A rear guard in the pass buying even a few more hours gave the retreating Greek force time to get clear without being run down by Persian cavalry. It gave the Greek fleet at Artemisium time for one more engagement before the army's withdrawal signaled the need to retreat. It preserved the option of a coherent Greek defense further south. Every soldier who escaped Thermopylae because of the rearguard's sacrifice was a soldier available for Salamis and Plataea. Leonidas may have stayed for all of these reasons simultaneously. Ancient military commanders were not simpler than modern ones. They operated inside religious, political, cultural, and military calculations at the same time, and the choice that fulfilled all of them at once was sometimes available. On the last morning, He moved his remaining force forward, out to the wider part of the pass, where the fighting would not be a linear defense, but a circular one, where the small force could fight outward in every direction rather than be trapped against a single wall. He chose his final ground with the same care he had chosen everything else. The fighting on the third morning was different in character from the previous 2 days. The Persian army came from both ends of the pass simultaneously, the main force from the north, and the immortals completing their march through the mountains from behind. The Greeks, surrounded, knowing they were going to die, fought with the particular quality that humans sometimes produce when survival is no longer the calculation. Without the tactical management of risk, without caution, without reserve. They had no reserve to hold. The Greek spears broke first. They shattered against Persian shields and bodies, were used as clubs when the shafts splintered, were finally thrown aside entirely. The Greeks fought with their swords, then with their hands, then with whatever came to hand, driven back step by step onto a small rise of ground behind the pass that the sources describe as a low hill. Leonidas died in the fighting. The exact circumstances are not preserved in any source. Herodotus notes his death as a fact and moves on. What the sources agree on is that his body became the center of the battle's final phase. The Greeks fought to prevent it from being taken. Desecrating a fallen enemy's body was a dishonor that the Greek world took seriously. The Persians fought to take it specifically because of that cultural weight. The body changed hands multiple times. The Greeks held it. The Thespians fought beside the Spartans until they were gone. All 700 of them. The Thebans, toward the end, threw down their weapons and surrendered. The ancient sources, written by Athenians and Spartans, record this with contempt, and the Thebans later claimed they had been forced to fight by Leonidas against their will. The truth of their motivations died with them. When the fighting ended, Xerxes had the body of Leonidas beheaded and crucified. Both of these acts violated the Persian norm for the treatment of a fallen enemy king, a norm that Xerxes himself had followed elsewhere. The violation tells you something about what those 3 days had cost him and what they had done to his certainty about the outcome of this campaign. He had lost, by ancient estimates, 20,000 men. He had needed a Greek traitor to find a mountain path his own intelligence missed. He had watched his immortals fail. He had seen his army, day after day, unable to do what an army of that size should have been able to do, simply by showing up. He had the body desecrated because the man was gone, and the body was all that was left. He crossed the pass and marched south. The Persian army moved through central Greece, burning as it went. Thespiae was razed. Plataea was burned. The Athenians, who had evacuated their city on the advice of Themistocles, sending their civilian population to the island of Salamis and to Troezen, watched from the water as the Persians set fire to the Acropolis. The temples burned. The city of Athens, which had beaten Persia at Marathon 10 years before and built the fleet that would ultimately destroy this invasion, was rubble and ash. It looked, in September of 480 BC, like complete Persian victory. 3 weeks later, in the strait between Salamis and the Attic mainland, everything reversed. Themistocles fought the Battle of Salamis, the way Leonidas had fought Thermopylae, by choosing ground that made the enemy's advantage irrelevant. The Persian fleet outnumbered the Greek fleet substantially. In open water, the Persian ships' numbers and the skill of their Phoenician and Egyptian crews would have been decisive. Themistocles needed to neutralize the numbers. He did it the same way Leonidas had neutralized the Persian army at Thermopylae, with narrow water, with constraint, with terrain that turned mass into a liability rather than an advantage. He lured the Persian fleet into the strait. The method he used is one of the most audacious deceptions in ancient naval history. He sent a trusted slave to Xerxes with a false message, claiming that the Greek fleet was about to scatter and flee, that Xerxes should attack immediately before the coalition collapsed. The message was a lie. The Greek fleet was not fleeing and not collapsing. But Xerxes believed it, or believed it enough, and ordered his fleet into the strait that night. The Persian fleet entered the narrow water between Salamis and the mainland in darkness, and was still deploying when dawn came, and the Greek triremes emerged to meet them. In the narrow strait, the Persian numerical advantage was gone. The Greek ships, smaller and more maneuverable, rammed and boarded and drove against Persian vessels that could not spread out, could not bring their numbers to bear, could not escape the confined geometry of the water around them. Xerxes watched from a throne on the shore, elevated above the strait, close enough to see the destruction of his fleet. The ancient sources describe him tearing his robes. His fleet was broken, not destroyed in its entirety, but broken as a fighting force. Without naval supremacy, his army could not be supplied through the coming winter. The Persian fleet retreated. Xerxes, with most of his army, withdrew to Asia before the winter closed the roads. He left behind a substantial force under his general Mardonius to continue the campaign the following year. In the summer of 479 BC, that force met the combined Greek army at Plataea in Boeotia on the plain south of Thebes. The Spartan army, finally freed of the religious constraints that had limited it at Thermopylae, fighting at its full strength under the regent Pausanias, was the core of the Greek force. The battle was harder and less clean than the subsequent tradition made it. Mardonius was a capable commander, and the Persian infantry were brave soldiers who fought until their general was killed and the battle became a rout. But the outcome was decisive. The Persian army in Greece was destroyed. The invasion was over. The Greek world had survived. What Thermopylae contributed to that survival was not the direct military result. The pass fell. Athens burned. The chain of consequences that saved Greece ran through Salamis and Plataea, not through the 3 days in the pass. What Thermopylae contributed was something harder to calculate and more important. It demonstrated, in the most concrete terms possible, that Persian soldiers could be killed in quantity by Greek soldiers in the right conditions. Every Greek city that was still calculating which side to join in September of 480 BC had watched Xerxes' army spend 2 days failing to break a force of 7,000 men. The calculation of those cities, the determination of whether Persian power was truly irresistible or merely very large, was affected by those 2 days. It gave the Greek fleet time to fight at Artemisium, while the army held the pass, 2 naval engagements in the waters off the northern coast of Euboea that damaged the Persian fleet and established that Greek triremes could compete effectively with Persian ships in the right conditions. It bought the Greek coalition 3 days that it used to assemble, to shore up its commitment, to prepare for what came next. And it produced something in the Greek cultural memory that is almost impossible to quantify, but that shows up everywhere in the literature and the art of the following century. A story about what was possible when people chose the right ground and held it, regardless of the cost. Within a generation of the battle, Simonides of Ceos wrote the epitaph that was placed on a monument at the pass. In ancient Greek, it is 10 words. It has been translated into every language in the world, and the translations argue about it, some emphasizing duty, some law, some obedience, some sacrifice, because the Greek is precise, and the precision resists being rendered exactly in any other tongue. Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Not glory, not heroism, not the freedom of civilization against tyranny, Obedience to their laws. Doing what their laws required. Nothing more ornate than that. The monument listed only the Spartans. The 700 Thespians had a monument of their own nearby, according to some sources. If it existed, it is gone. If the epitaph existed, it is lost. The Thespians who stayed in the pass and died there alongside the people history remembered have been absorbed into the background of the story that history chose to tell. The movie got the spectacle right, and the meaning almost entirely wrong. The visual grammar of 300, the shields, the crimson capes, the narrow pass, the impossible odds, captures something real about the experience it is trying to convey. The feeling of those images is not entirely unfaithful to the emotional weight of the actual event, but the movie made 300 Spartans into 300 superhuman warriors who were essentially the only Greeks at Thermopylae, fighting alone against a quasi-supernatural Oriental empire, dying for the ideal of freedom against tyranny. That version is significantly false in almost every particular. 7,000 Greeks were at Thermopylae. 31 Greek cities were committed to resistance. The Persian Empire was not a supernatural evil. It was a sophisticated and, in many ways, admirable civilization that happened to be attempting to conquer Greece for rational imperial reasons. The Spartans themselves were not the gleaming physiques of the film. They were professional soldiers, fighting in bronze armor in late summer heat, almost certainly older, and more scarred, and more tired-looking than their cinematic versions. Their culture was remarkable. The agog, the syssitia, the absolute commitment to military excellence. But it was also built on the systematic exploitation of the helots, the enslaved population that made Spartan military culture economically possible, a fact that the film understandably but significantly omits. Ephialtes was almost certainly not a deformed outcast seeking personal revenge. He was a local man who made a rational calculation about which side was going to win. The calculation was not unreasonable. Nearly half of Greece had made the same one. History judged him harshly because the other side won. Had Persia prevailed, he would have been remembered as a pragmatist. And Leonidas was not a 30-year-old muscle-bound hero bellowing inspirational speeches. He was a 55-year-old king who had spent his life inside the most complete military culture the ancient world produced, who understood his situation with the precision that such a life develops, who chose his ground, placed his force correctly, held for 3 days, and died as he had arranged to die from the beginning. That is not a lesser story. It is a greater one. It requires understanding sacrifice as a strategic act, dying not for glory or for a photograph, but for the specific, calculated purpose of buying the living enough time to do something with the time you have purchased. 3 days. Bought with everything. Used by the survivors to win at Salamis, to hold at Plataea, to save a civilization that would produce Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the Parthenon and the foundations of the political and intellectual tradition that the Western world still draws from. The pass at Thermopylae today is a broad coastal plain. The sea has retreated over 2.5 millennia of sediment deposition. The hot springs still bubble up from the rocks. There is a bronze statue of Leonidas looking north, jaw set, shield raised, toward where the Persian army came from. He looks nothing like the actor who played him. He looks like what he was. An old soldier who understood the situation clearly, who chose the ground, who placed his men, who held it for as long as it could be held, at exactly the cost he had arranged from the beginning. The 700 Thespians who died beside him are not in the statue. There is a separate memorial for them on the hill above the road, smaller and visited by fewer tourists. It has an epitaph that acknowledges they were there. They were there. They stayed when they could have left. They died in the same pass for the same reason, with less cultural imperative to do so, and with less of history's memory to carry them forward. They are the part of this story that most honestly represents what happened. Not the superhuman warriors of myth, not the idealized defenders of civilization, but ordinary soldiers of an ordinary city who understood that someone had to hold the ground, and they were the ones who were there. 3 days. That is what was purchased. 3 days that became Salamis. 3 days that became Plataea. 3 days that became the classical civilization of the 5th century BC, whose ideas are still alive in the world 2,500 years later. Go, tell the Spartans, and the Thespians, and everyone else who stood in a narrow pass in the August heat, because the ground was right, and the cause was real, and someone had to hold it. They held it. The Persian Empire. That Xerxes ruled in 480 BC deserves more than the role of backdrop villain that it has been assigned by the tradition flowing from Greek sources. Persia was, by the standards of the ancient world, a genuinely sophisticated civilization. The Achaemenid dynasty that ruled it had developed administrative systems of considerable elegance. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each administered by a satrap who reported to the king, with a system of royal inspectors who traveled the empire, auditing the satraps to prevent the accumulation of too much independent power. The Persian Royal Road ran nearly 2,000 miles from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in the Persian heartland, with a postal system of relay stations that allowed a message to travel the entire length in approximately a week, a communication speed that the Roman Empire would not significantly improve upon for centuries. Persian religious policy was, by the norms of ancient empire, unusually tolerant. Cyrus the Great had allowed the Jews exiled in Babylon to return to Judea and rebuild their temple, an act remembered in the Hebrew Bible as one of the great acts of benevolent kingship. Persian rulers generally allowed the peoples they conquered to continue practicing their own religions, maintaining their own temples, and observing their own customs, as long as they paid their taxes and provided their military contingents. The Persian army was not an undifferentiated mass of slaves driven forward by whips. It was a professional force with distinct units, established tactics, genuine military traditions, and soldiers who fought by choice or by the cultural obligation of their communities rather than by compulsion. The immortals who failed at Thermopylae were not cowards or incompetents. They were excellent soldiers who found that excellent soldiers in the wrong terrain cannot compensate for the terrain. The Greek tradition that came out of the Persian Wars framed the conflict as civilization versus barbarism, freedom versus slavery, rationality versus despotism. This framing served Greek cultural and political purposes and has profoundly shaped how the Western world has understood the conflict ever since. It was not, to put it plainly, an accurate description of what Persia was. What Persia was, in 480 BC, was a large empire with rational reasons to want to control the troublesome Greek cities of the Aegean, both the ones on the coast of Asia Minor that it already nominally controlled, and the ones on the Greek mainland that kept supporting revolts against that control. The invasion was not a jihad against Western civilization. It was a punitive imperial expedition that expanded into a full conquest attempt when the initial punitive operation failed at Marathon. Understanding this does not diminish what the Greeks did at Thermopylae, at Salamis, or at Plataea. It makes it more impressive, not less, because it removes the cosmic scale and replaces it with the human one. Ordinary soldiers of various cities making decisions about whether to stand and fight or submit and survive under conditions of genuine uncertainty about the outcome, against a real and competent enemy that was not evil, but was genuinely threatening to end Greek independence. The choice Leonidas made, the choice the Thespians made, the choice Themistocles had made years before by pushing for the fleet. These were choices made by actual human beings with limited information and genuinely uncertain outcomes. The mythology that surrounds Thermopylae can make it seem inevitable in retrospect, as though the Spartans were always going to hold the pass and the Greeks were always going to win. None of it was inevitable. All of it was chosen. The Greek city-state system that produced Thermopylae deserves examination because it is simultaneously the reason Greek resistance was so difficult to organize and the reason it produced soldiers capable of holding a pass against a force many times their size. A polis, a Greek city-state, was a genuinely unusual political entity by the standards of the ancient world. It was typically a city and its surrounding agricultural territory, ranging in total population from a few thousand to perhaps 40,000 citizens in the largest cases. What made it distinctive was the degree to which political life was organized around the active participation of its citizens in governance, military service, and the cultural institutions that defined the community. In Athens, by 480 BC, this participation had been extended through a series of reforms over the preceding century into something that functioned as a direct democracy for its male citizen class. Approximately 40,000 adult men who voted in assembly on major decisions, who served on juries, who held public offices by election or lottery, and who constituted the military force of the city in the form of the citizen army. The fleet that Themistocles built was crewed by the poorest Athenian citizens, the Thetes, men who owned no land and had previously held no military role because they could not afford hoplite equipment. The fleet gave them a military function and therefore a political stake in the city's defense that they had not previously held. In Sparta, the citizen body was smaller, perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 Spartiates in 480 BC, but the depth of their commitment to the military community was unmatched anywhere in the Greek world. Spartiates were, essentially, professional soldiers, maintained by the labor of the helots and the perioikoi, the free but non-citizen population of Laconia. They did not farm, trade, or practice crafts. They trained, competed, and fought. Their entire social structure was organized around military effectiveness in a way that no other ancient society sustained for as long as Sparta did. The contrast between these two systems and the tension between them runs through everything that happened in 480 BC. Athens provided the fleet without which Salamis was impossible. Sparta provided the land army without which Plataea was impossible. Neither could have succeeded without the other. Neither particularly wanted to depend on the other. The alliance between them was real, but genuinely uncomfortable, and it survived the Persian Wars only long enough to begin unraveling into the conflicts that would eventually dominate the second half of the 5th century. What both systems shared was the production of soldiers who understood why they were fighting. Greek hoplites were not conscripts dragged from farms by royal command. They were citizens defending their own communities, fighting in a formation that required the absolute trust of the man beside you, trained from youth in the culture that defined their identity. They fought as they did at Thermopylae, holding against an enemy that should have overwhelmed them, because the thing they were holding was not abstract. It was their city, their families, their way of life as they understood it. This is what Xerxes and Leonidas discussed, and what Xerxes could not fully grasp from inside a political system where obedience flowed downward from royal authority. The Greek soldier at Thermopylae was not there because a king had ordered him there, and he feared the consequences of refusal. He was there because he had voted, or his city had voted, or his culture had produced in him the conviction that this was what a man did when his world was threatened. The Persian army was not composed of slaves in any meaningful sense, but its relationship to authority was different from the Greek one in a way that mattered in the specific context of a defensive battle, where the question was not whether you could advance, but whether you would hold. The memory of Thermopylae began accumulating almost immediately after the battle and has not stopped since. Within 50 years, Herodotus had written the history that preserved the event for posterity, the first major work of prose historical writing in the Western tradition, structured around the question of why the Persian Wars happened and what they meant. Herodotus was an Ionian Greek who traveled extensively and interviewed people with direct knowledge of the events he described, including veterans and the children of participants. His account of Thermopylae is the foundation of everything we know about the battle, and it is told with the dramatic compression and narrative shaping of a man who understood he was writing about events that mattered. The Athenian playwright Aeschylus, who had himself fought at Marathon and possibly at Salamis, wrote the Persians in 472 BC, the oldest surviving Greek tragedy, dramatizing the Persian defeat from the Persian perspective, showing Xerxes returning to his court in shame. The play treats Xerxes not as a monster, but as a man destroyed by hubris, the Greek concept of overreaching pride that brings divine punishment. The Persian court in Aeschylus is not evil, but tragic, which is a more honest and more interesting response to the war than the simple barbarism versus civilization framework. Simonides of Ceos wrote the epitaphs, not just the Spartan one that has survived, but apparently several others, for different contingents at Thermopylae and the naval battle at Artemisium. He was the most celebrated lyric poet of his generation, and his commissions for the memorials of the Persian Wars were among the defining works of his career. The Spartan epitaph has survived because it was quoted repeatedly in later antiquity. The others have mostly been lost. The Spartans built a cult around Leonidas specifically. His bones were eventually brought back to Sparta and interred there. Annual ceremonies were held in his honor. He was not merely remembered, he was venerated as a hero in the technical Greek sense, a man elevated above ordinary mortality by the circumstances of his death and the consequences that flowed from it. Thespiae, rebuilt after the Persian destruction, maintained its own memory of the 700. The city survived, was rebuilt, and continued to exist through the classical period. Whether it preserved the names of its dead from Thermopylae, we do not know. If it did, those records have not survived. Military historians have studied Thermopylae continuously since the ancient world. The battle appears in virtually every study of defensive tactics, terrain utilization, and the management of numerical disadvantage. It is taught alongside Cannae and Agincourt as one of the canonical examples of how smaller forces can defeat larger ones by controlling the conditions under which the fighting occurs. The principle it illustrates, that terrain selection can neutralize numerical advantage, has been applied in conflicts from the Swiss defense of Alpine passes in the medieval period to the defensive battles of the American Civil War to the analysis of modern mountain warfare doctrine. The story has been retold in every medium the Western tradition has produced: epic poetry, lyric epitaphs, tragedy, history, sculpture, painting, novel, film, graphic novel, video game. Thermopylae has been rendered in all of them and will continue to be. It survives because it contains something that every human culture recognizes across whatever differences of language, era, and context separate them from 5th century BC Greece. The choice to hold a position you cannot ultimately hold, for long enough that the holding matters, at a cost you cannot recover from. The choice, made clearly, with full understanding of what it costs. That is what Leonidas chose. That is what the 700 Thespians chose. That is what the handful of other Greeks who stayed chose. Not victory, not survival. The purchase of time at the price of everything, for people who would use the time for something worth the price. The Battle of Salamis that followed 3 weeks after Thermopylae is in some ways the more consequential engagement. It was Salamis that broke Persian sea power and made the invasion logistically unsustainable. Salamis that gave Greece the victory that Thermopylae could only prepare for. But Salamis has never captured the imagination of the Western world the way Thermopylae has, and the reason for this disparity tells you something true about what human beings find meaningful in military history. Salamis was a naval victory. It was clever, well executed, decisive, and the product of Themistocles' strategic genius, a genius that in many ways exceeded Leonidas's, since Themistocles was managing not just a battle, but a political coalition, a fleet of 200 ships crewed by men who had never fought a major naval engagement, and a deception operation against the most powerful ruler in the world, all simultaneously. But naval victories are hard to personalize. The crew of a trireme is not 300 Spartans. The narrative of a fleet action does not concentrate to a single human figure, the way the narrative of a defensive stand does. Salamis was a system working, a fleet, a plan, a strait, an enemy maneuvered into the wrong position. It was brilliant, and it was decisive, and it has never generated a movie. Thermopylae generated a movie because it has a hero, it has a place, it has a number, 300, small enough to be humanly comprehensible, large enough to be impressive. It has a moment, Malon Labe, quotable across 2,500 years. It has a monument with an epitaph that says exactly the right thing in exactly the right number of words. It has, above everything else, the quality that the greatest military stories share with the greatest human stories. The quality of a clear choice made under impossible circumstances, for a reason that transcends the individual making it, at a cost that cannot be argued with. Leonidas chose to die in the pass rather than leave it. The Thespians chose to die in the pass because they had nowhere else to be, and someone had to hold it. The result was 3 days that became a chain of consequences that became the world. 2,500 years later, we are still carrying it. The Spartan military system that produced Leonidas and the 300 is worth understanding in its full strangeness, because it was genuinely unlike anything else the ancient world produced, and because the strangeness is essential to understanding why the men it produced could stand in that pass and hold it. The agoge, the Spartan state education and training system, began at age 7. Boys were taken from their families, assigned to peer groups called agili, herds, and placed under the supervision of older youths and adult overseers. For the next 23 years, until the age of 30, their lives were entirely organized around the state's needs, rather than their own or their families. They slept communally, ate communally, trained together, competed against each other, and were subjected to deliberate physical hardship, cold, hunger, pain, as a systematic method of conditioning. They were given inadequate food and encouraged to steal to supplement it, not because the state approved of theft, but because the process of stealing without being caught developed the qualities of stealth, initiative, and cunning that military intelligence requires. Physical toughness was only part of the curriculum. The agoge also trained what the Spartans called laconism, the ability to say the most with the fewest words. Spartan boys were trained to speak briefly, precisely, and pointedly, and were mocked and penalized for verbosity. Molon Labe, come and take them, is the distillation of this training into its purest form. 2 words that say everything and nothing else. At 30, a Spartan man became a full citizen, a Spartiate, and could establish a household, though he still ate in the communal mess with his age group for his entire adult life. Military service continued until 60. The age of full citizenship, at 30, was when a Spartan soldier reached his peak, having spent his entire conscious life developing the skills and conditioning and psychological qualities that made him what he was. Leonidas, at 55, had spent 48 years in this system. He had been inside the Agage for 23 years and a full Spartiate for 25. He had been trained to hold position under pressure for nearly 5 decades. The idea of retreating from an enemy, the idea of yielding ground that he had chosen to defend, was not simply against his orders. It was against the entire structure of his psychology, the result of a lifetime's conditioning designed to produce exactly the quality that kept 7,000 Greeks in a pass against 150,000 Persians for 3 days. The ancient world produced many remarkable soldiers. It produced very few military cultures as complete as this one. The Athenian evacuation that preceded the Persian burning of Athens deserves attention because it was one of the most remarkable collective decisions in the history of the ancient world, and because it is the context that gives the 3 days at Thermopylae their full weight. Athens in 480 BC had a population of perhaps 100,000 people, including citizens, resident foreigners, and slaves. When the Persian army broke through Thermopylae and began marching south, the Athenians faced a choice that no city in the ancient world had faced quite so starkly: fight for the city that had been their world for generations, or abandon it. They abandoned it. The decision was not made easily or unanimously. The ancient sources describe significant debate and significant resistance. But Themistocles had managed the political process skillfully, and a second Delphic oracle, which spoke of a wooden wall that would protect Athens, had been interpreted, under his guidance, as meaning the fleet rather than a physical wall. The oracle's framing of the question gave the Athenians a divine mandate for the decision they needed to make for strategic reasons. The evacuation was organized over a period of days. Citizens without the means to transport their own households received assistance from the state and from the neighboring communities that took them in. Troezen, a small city in the Peloponnese, fed and housed Athenian evacuees at public expense for the duration of the crisis. The inscription recording Troezen's assistance, the Themistocles Decree, if it is authentic, is one of the more moving documents to survive from ancient Athens, recording the specific logistical arrangements for a city opening itself to the homeless citizens of another. When the Persians arrived at Athens and found it empty, they burned it anyway. The burning was partly strategic, destroying the infrastructure of a hostile city, and partly punitive, the same logic that drove Xerxes to desecrate Leonidas's body. Athens had Marathon on its record. Athens had supported the Ionian revolt. Athens had continued to resist when resistance was clearly suicidal. The burning was Persia's statement about what defiance cost. The Athenians had evacuated without certainty that the gamble would pay off. They did not know, when they left their homes and their temples and their city, that Salamis would happen 3 weeks later. They knew that the fleet was their only chance. They had bet everything on a naval engagement against the largest navy the ancient world had assembled, in a strait between an island and the mainland, commanded by a general who was simultaneously managing the most fragile military coalition in Greek history. It paid off. Not because it was inevitable, but because the people who made it happen were competent, committed, and in the right place, at the right time with the right tools. The wooden wall held. The chain from Thermopylae to the modern world is longer and stranger than the standard telling acknowledges. The battle itself happened in 480 BC. Within a generation, Athens, no longer threatened by Persia and freed of the existential pressure that had made cooperation with Sparta necessary, entered its classical period. The Parthenon was built. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote the plays that defined the Western dramatic tradition. Socrates was born in 469 BC, 9 years after Thermopylae, and began the intellectual project that produced Plato, who produced Aristotle, who taught Alexander the Great. None of this is inevitable. None of it happens if Persia wins. If Xerxes breaks through at Thermopylae and destroys the Greek fleet before Salamis, if Athens is not merely burned, but occupied, and its population absorbed into the Persian imperial system, the trajectory of Western intellectual and cultural history runs differently. Not necessarily worse in every respect, because Persian civilization was not culturally impoverished, but differently, substantially differently. The traditions of philosophy, democracy, drama, history, and science that the Western world traces to classical Athens, and through Athens to Rome, and through Rome to the medieval world, and through the medieval world to the Renaissance, and through the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, and through the Enlightenment to the modern political and intellectual world. Those traditions were not inevitable. They were contingent. They required a specific sequence of events to occur, and that sequence required the chain of Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea to hold. This is not an argument that Greek civilization was superior to Persian civilization. It is an argument about contingency, about the way that specific human choices at specific moments shape what comes after in ways that are impossible to predict and difficult to trace fully, even in retrospect. Leonidas chose to hold the pass. The Thespians chose to stay. Themistocles chose to build the fleet. The Athenians chose to evacuate. The Greek alliance chose to hold at Plataea. Each of these choices was genuinely uncertain at the moment of making, genuinely costly in some cases, and together they produced a specific outcome rather than any of the other outcomes that were equally possible. That is what history is, not the working out of inevitable forces toward predetermined ends. Specific people making specific choices under conditions of genuine uncertainty, and those choices having consequences that ripple forward in ways that none of the people making them could fully see. Leonidas did not save Western civilization. He held a pass for 3 days so that the people who held it after him might have a chance to do the things that, together, produced a world where Western civilization was possible. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is what 3 days can do, when they are the right 3 days, held by the right people, in the right place. The question of what made Greek hoplite warfare so effective against larger forces, not just at Thermopylae but across the Persian wars, touches on something fundamental about the relationship between political culture and military capacity that ancient historians understood, but modern popular history tends to skip over. Greek hoplites were expensive. The panoply, the full set of armor and weapons, cost the equivalent of a year or more of agricultural income for a typical farmer. Only citizens with sufficient land to produce a surplus could afford to equip themselves. This meant that the hoplite class was, by definition, the propertied citizen class, the men who owned the land that the city-state's agricultural economy depended on, who had voting rights in the assembly, who paid the taxes that funded the city's common operations. When these men formed a phalanx and marched into battle, they were defending something they owned, literally. The land behind them was their land. The city they marched from was their political community, the place where their votes mattered and their voices were heard. They were not defending an abstraction. They were defending the specific physical and political reality that made their lives what they were. This is the thing that Demaratus tried to explain to Xerxes, and that Xerxes could not entirely grasp. The Persian king understood obedience enforced by authority. He understood soldiers who fought because the consequences of not fighting were severe. He did not have a full framework for soldiers who fought because the thing being defended was genuinely and personally theirs. The naval victory at Salamis extended this principle to a new class of Athenian citizens, the Thetes, the propertyless poor who crewed the fleet, discovered at Salamis that they too could fight effectively for their city, and their city's survival depended on them as much as on the hoplites. The political consequence was the further democratization of Athens in the decades after the Persian Wars, as the naval class demanded and received political recognition commensurate with their military contribution. The fleet that Themistocles built to win the war became the instrument of the political transformation that defined the classical period. The Persian Wars did not just save Greek civilization, they changed it. They produced the Athens of Pericles and the Parthenon and the great dramatists, not despite the war, but partly because of it. Because the experience of fighting together, of the Athenian poor proving their worth at the oars of a trireme, of the coalition between Athens and Sparta, working when it had to, changed what was possible in Greek political life in ways that the pre-war world had not allowed. Thermopylae is remembered as an ending. It was also a beginning. 3 days, that is the unit of measurement. 3 days held in a pass, where the hot springs made the air smell faintly of rotten eggs, and the mountains came down so close to the sea that a wagon barely fit between them. 3 days that became a naval battle in a strait between an island and the mainland, where the Greek fleet broke the power of the largest navy in the ancient world. 3 days that became a land battle on a plain in Boeotia the following summer, where the Spartan army, finally fully deployed, the festival over, the religious constraint lifted, destroyed the last Persian force in Greece. 3 days that became the 5th century BC in Athens, which became Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and the Parthenon and the tradition of philosophical inquiry that is still alive in the world. 3 days that became, in the memory of the people who survived them and the civilization they made possible, the proof that a small force in the right place could hold against any odds, that numbers were not destiny, that the ground mattered, that 300 people willing to hold their position could purchase something that 100,000 people unwilling to hold theirs could not. Leonidas knew this. He had chosen the pass for exactly this reason. He had placed his men correctly, rotated his units, held the line for 2 full days before the mountain path undid everything. He had done what could be done with what he had, in the place he had chosen, for as long as it could be held. The last morning, when the immortals came down from the mountain and the main Persian force pushed from the north, he moved his remaining men forward to the widest point of the pass and prepared to die facing outward in every direction. He held the ground he had chosen. That is all. That is everything. Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. And tell the Thespians too, and everyone else who stood in the pass and understood what it cost and paid it anyway. They held it.